something with me. Let's say you have this dream of building the perfect house. I'm talking like a mansion, something that makes the neighbors jealous.
Mm-hmm.
And naturally, you want the best advice, so you go to the most famous architect in the world. And this guy, he lived in an absolute palace, gold gates, marble floors, the works.
Okay, I feel like there's a trap coming here.
Oh, there is. You knock on his door and you ask, "What is the secret? How do I build a house like yours?" And he looks you dead in the eye and says, "Well, the secret to my success is that I don't have a roof and I took down all the walls. That's how I live right now. Open air concept, and look how rich I am. You should do the exact same thing."
That is just terrible advice. You would freeze to death in a week.
Exactly. It's completely absurd. You'd look at him like he was crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the thing. The source material we're covering today argues that this is effectively what the world's richest nations have been telling developing countries to do with their economies for the last 40 years.
It's a provocative metaphor, but honestly, it captures the core thesis of today's deep dive perfectly. We are looking at a really fascinating piece of analysis called reassessing free market orthodoxy.
And what I love about this is that it isn't just dry theory. It focuses heavily on the work of economist Ha-Joon Chang and his famous concept of kicking away the ladder, but then it takes those big ideas and sort of crash lands them right into East Africa.
Right, with a specific look at the unique case of Somaliland.
Exactly.
And it's a bit of a record scratch moment for anyone who, breezed through Economics 101. We are usually taught that the universal best practice for getting rich is simple. Open your markets, trade freely, and get the government out of the way.
That's the Washington Consensus, right? The standard package deal.
That's the one. But our mission today is to unpack the argument that this advice is historically false. That rich countries didn't actually use free trade to get rich. They used the exact opposite.
Wow.
And the source argues that by forcing developing nations to liberalize too early, we might be actively preventing them from growing.
So we are going to look at the receipts. We're going to dig into the history of the U.S. and U.K. that usually gets, left out of the textbooks, and then see how that history, or the lack of it, is playing out on the ground in Somaliland right now.
We have to look at what's called the historical political economy. Basically, we need to ignore what rich countries say they did and look at what they actually did.
I love that. Let's dive in. To understand why this matters, we need to set the scene. The article zooms in on East Africa starting around, the 1980s?
The 80s, yeah?
What was the economic mood music back then? Because my impression is that it was a time of pretty intense change.
It was. The mood was very much defined by what we call neoliberal prescriptions. If you were a policymaker in, say, Kenya or Tanzania or Uganda in the 80s and 90s, you didn't really have a lot of choices. The advice coming from the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, was a package deal.
And this wasn't really a suggestion, was it? It wasn't like, hey, maybe try this. It was more like,
oh, not at all. If you want loans to keep your lights on, you do this. It was conditional. And the condition was structural adjustment.
right.
You had to liberalize trade, meaning drop your tariffs and let foreign goods flow in. You had to privatize state-owned companies. And above all, you had to limit state intervention.
The logic being that governments in these regions were inherently inefficient, maybe bloated, and probably a little corrupt.
Exactly.
So if you just get them out of the way, the invisible hand of the market will sweep in, build factories, and create wealth.
That was the promise. These weren't presented as options. They were presented as universal best practices. The assumption was that there is one single path to prosperity, a one-size-fits-all roadmap, and this was it.
Okay, so East Africa takes the prescription. They follow the rules. They
Yeah.
cut the tariffs. They sell the state companies. But the article points out a really glaring problem with the results.
The problem is persistent under-industrialization.
Under-industrialization. That feels like a paradox.
Yeah.
If they did all the things that are supposed to create a modern economy, why aren't there more factories? Why isn't there a manufacturing boom?
That is the million-dollar question. The article highlights that despite decades of following these free market rules, the region is still largely stuck selling, raw materials. They haven't made that jump to manufacturing.
It's like following a recipe perfectly for 40 years, checking the oven every 10 minutes, and the cake still hasn't risen.
That's a great analogy, and this is where the conversation usually splits. The standard economist response, the one you'd hear on the news, would be, well, maybe they didn't follow the rules hard enough. Maybe they need more privatization.
Right. Blaming the chef, not the recipe. You didn't whisk it hard enough.
Exactly. But our source takes a completely different angle. It asks, what if the recipe itself is wrong? Or, to be more nuanced, What if it's the wrong recipe for this specific stage of cooking?
And that pivots us to the core concept of the source material, the ladder. This is Ha-Joon Chang's big idea, kicking away the ladder. Let's unpack that because it sounds a little malicious. What does the ladder represent?
So imagine the ladder represents the specific policies that a country uses to climb up from poverty to wealth. Historically, those policies were things like protectionism, high tariffs on imports, government subsidies.
Which is funny because those are the exact things we are told are bad economics today.
Right. But the argument is that the developed countries, the UK, the US, Germany, they all climbed up that exact ladder to get where they are. They used protectionism heavily.
But now they are at the top.
And now that they're at the top, rich and competitive, they kick the ladder away. They turn around and tell developing nations, oh, you shouldn't use those policies. They're inefficient. You should use free trade.
That is incredibly sneaky. It's like pulling up the drawbridge after you're safe inside the castle.
That is the accusation. And the article provides some really strong historical evidence to back this up. We tend to think of the United States as the absolute champion of free trade, the brand manager for capitalism.
For sure. The American dream is built on the open market. When we think of the 19th century as this wild free market frontier.
But if you look at the actual history, especially from the Civil War up to World War II, the United States was one of the most protectionist countries in the world.
Really? The most protectionist. That sounds incorrect.
It sounds incorrect because it goes against the national myth, but absolutely. The U.S. government used incredibly high tariffs, we're talking taxes on imported goods, to keep British products out.
Why? I mean, Britain was the workshop of the world back then. They made good stuff.
Exactly. And that was the problem. They were protecting their infant industries. Think about it. In, say, 1860, British textile mills were vastly superior to American ones. More efficient, cheaper, higher quality.
Okay.
If the U.S. had just opened its borders and said, may the best product win, the American factories would have been crushed instantly.
Because they couldn't compete on price or quality yet.
They wouldn't have survived a month. So the U.S., well, they rigged the game. They put up a wall of tariffs, sometimes 40 or 50%, that made British cloth artificially expensive. This gave American factories a captive market and, crucially, time. Time to learn, time to make mistakes, and eventually time to get good.
I want to pause on that because it's such a flip of the narrative. We usually hear that protectionism makes companies lazy, that if you protect them from competition, they just produce garbage and charge high prices.
And that is a real risk. We've seen that happen in some countries where protectionism became permanent. But the U.S. and later countries like South Korea and Japan used that protection strategically. It wasn't protection forever.
It was protection until you grow up.
Exactly. It's like training wheels. You don't put a kid on a bike and immediately shove them into the Tour de France. You give them training wheels. And you don't take the training wheels off until they can balance. The critique in this article is that the international advice to East Africa has been, training wheels are inefficient. They slow you down. Take them off immediately.
And then we wonder why the bike keeps falling over.
Exactly. The source points out this historical inconsistency. The developed world is insisting that East Africa liberalize before they have an industrial base. But the developed world only liberalized after their industrial base was mature.
So asking a developing nation to adopt free trade right now is essentially asking them to compete in the Olympics without any training.
That connects to the bigger picture here. The expert critique isn't that free markets are bad in a moral sense. It's that the timing is wrong. It's a sequencing error. You can't skip the ladder phase and expect to magically arrive at the roof phase.
Okay, let's bring this down to earth. We've got this theory of the ladder, and we've got the history of the U.S. showing how it worked for them. But how does this play out right now on the ground? The article focuses specifically on Somaliland as a case study. Why Somaliland?
Somaliland is a fascinating case because it kind of isolates the variable. The article describes the economic structure there. Like much of East Africa, it's heavily dependent on primary commodity exports.
Primary commodity exports. Okay, break that down for us. We're talking about raw stuff, right?
Right. Livestock, agriculture, stuff you grow or pull out of the ground. In Somaliland's case, it's heavily focused on livestock camels, sheep, goats being shipped to the Gulf states.
And why is that a problem? I mean, trade is trade, isn't it? If they're good at raising camels, why shouldn't they just sell camels?
They should, but the problem is where the value lives. There is a ceiling on how rich a nation can get by just selling raw animals. The real value in the global economy comes from processing. If you sell a raw hide, you get pennies. If you turn that hide into high-quality leather and then into a designer handbag, you get hundreds of dollars.
That's the industrial part of industrialization, adding value.
Exactly, and Somaliland isn't making that jump. But here is the paradox the article points out. Somaliland actually has some unique positives. It has relative stability compared to its neighbors, and importantly, it has strong private sector activity.
That's interesting. Usually when economists explain why a country is poor, they blame instability or a weak private sector. They say, oh, the market can't work there because it's too chaotic.
Right, the people aren't entrepreneurial. But in Somaliland, the private sector is hustling. People are trading, money is moving, the telecom sector is vibrant, the markets are working. But, and this is the key, it still lacks an industrial base. It hasn't made that leap from trading camels to building factories.
So if they have this stability and they have the private sector hustle, why no factories?
Well, if you leave the neoliberal rule book, the answer would have to be the government must be in the way, deregulate more. But the article argues the complete opposite. It says the problem is insufficient strategic protection and coordination.
Meaning the government isn't doing enough.
Not doing enough of the right things, the government hasn't been allowed or maybe encouraged to build the latter.
Wow. So in this context, doing less, stepping back, is actually the wrong move.
It appears so. Let's just play this out. Think about a potential Somali entrepreneur who wants to start, say, a shoe factory to process that leather we talked about.
Okay, I'm picturing it. He's got the leather, he's got the workers.
But without any protection, that new factory has to compete immediately with cheap shoes coming in from China or secondhand shoes from the West. The Somali factory will be slower, less efficient, and more expensive at first because they're just figuring things out.
Because they are learning. It's the infant industry problem all over again.
Right. So the consumer who is rational looks at the expensive Somali shoe and the cheap imported shoe and buys the imported one. The Somali factory goes bust. The market has spoken. It was inefficient.
But the result is that the country never learns how to make shoes. It stays stuck selling rawhides.
Whereas if the government slapped a tariff on imported shoes for 10 years,
Then the imported shoes become more expensive. The consumer buys the local shoes. The factory survives, makes a profit, reinvests that profit into better machines.
and 10 years later, maybe it can compete with China. That is the latter.
I want to push back on this a little bit, though, because we hear a lot of horror stories about this. The government protects the local industry, but instead of getting better, the local factory just stays expensive and makes terrible shoes because they have no competition.
Yeah.
It becomes cronyism.
That is a very real danger. And the article isn't naive about that. It's not calling for the government to just hand out cash to their friends or block imports forever. It's calling for strategic protection.
What's the difference between strategic protection and just, protectionism?
Discipline. If you look at the Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, their governments protected industries, but they also held them accountable. They said, we will protect you, but you have to meet export targets. You have to prove you are getting better. If you don't, we cut you off.
So it's a bargain. We give you a shield, you give us performance.
Exactly. It's not state versus market. It's the state incubating the market. It's the state acting like a venture capitalist or a coach.
That's a crucial distinction, because often the debate is presented as so binary. Communism versus capitalism. You either have the state running everything or the market running everything.
Yeah.
But this is saying there's a middle path.
The path the U.S. actually took, correct. The article argues that Somaliland and East Africa broadly needs the freedom to use these tools. They need the policy space to experiment.
So bringing it back to the big picture, the article is calling for a reevaluation of free market orthodoxy.
Wow.
What does the path forward actually look like? If they toss out the neoliberal rulebook, what replaces it?
The author is careful here. It's not about rejecting markets entirely. We aren't going back to a command economy. It's about the timing and sequencing of liberalization.
Sequencing. First you build the factory, then you open the doors.
Yes. The conclusion is that policymakers need to reassert the role of the state. They need to stop apologizing for intervening and start seeing it as a necessary tool for what's called structural transformation.
Structural transformation. That's the shift from selling raw stuff to making things.
And the argument is that this transformation rarely happens by accident. It almost never happens just because you got the government out of the way. It happens because you have a strategy. And the article suggests they may need the latter that developed nations used: tariffs, subsidies.
Which brings us to a really interesting irony. Usually, we equate economic freedom with the freedom to trade. We have free trade agreements. But here, true freedom for a developing nation might be the freedom to not trade. at least not on someone else's terms.
That is a profound point. If freedom just means the freedom to remain poor because you can't compete, is it really freedom? The article implies that true sovereignty for a developing nation includes the right to shape its own economic destiny.
Even if that means breaking the universal rules set by the IMF or the World Bank.
Exactly.
It really challenges the one-size-fits-all approach.
Yep.
It's like we've been handing out heavy winter coats to people in the desert, because wearing coats is what worked for people in Norway.
And then blaming them when they pass out from heat stroke. Context matters. History matters. The article is essentially a plea for historical honesty. If we want to help Somaliland develop, we shouldn't tell them to do what we do now. You should tell them to do what we did then.
That is a massive shift in perspective. It takes a lot of confidence to look at the experts in suits coming from Geneva or Washington and say, you know what, your advice is historically inaccurate.
It does. But the evidence in the article, the persistent under-industrialization, suggests that the current advice simply isn't working. When the results don't match the theory, it's time to question the theory.
And it suggests that maybe best practices aren't actually universal, they're temporal. They depend on what time it is in your economic life cycle. So let's recap what we've covered today, because we've traveled through time and geography. We started with a record scratch, the realization that rich countries didn't get rich through free trade.
We looked at the neoliberal prescription in East Africa, privatization, liberalization, and saw that while it was followed, it didn't lead to the promised industrial boom.
Then we unpacked Ha-Joon Chang's ladder metaphor, the idea that protectionism, tariffs, subsidies was the actual tool used by the U.S. and Britain to climb to prosperity.
And that banning those tools now is effectively kicking the ladder away.
Then we applied that to Somaliland, a place with stability and private sector energy, but which lacks the strategic state protection needed to turn that energy into hard industry.
And finally, we discussed the path forward, a reassertion of the state's role, not as an enemy of the market, but as a strategic partner to help it grow up.
It really makes you look at the world map a little differently, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We often look at developing nations and think, why can't they just get their act together? But maybe they are trying to play a game where the rules are rigged against the very strategies that lead to winning.
It certainly raises the question of fairness in the global economic system. Are we helping these nations, or are we effectively keeping them in their place by denying them the tools we used ourselves?
That is the big question. And here is a final thought to chew on as you go about your day. We talk a lot about innovation in business disrupting the market, trying new things, but we rarely talk about innovation in policy.
That is true. We tend to think policy is settled science.
But if the universal best practices of the last 40 years have led to persistent under-industrialization in places like East Africa, maybe the most innovative thing a developing nation can do is to stop listening to the experts.
Or perhaps to listen to the history books instead of the rule books.
Exactly. Does true economic freedom for a developing nation actually mean having the freedom to restrict the market until it's ready to compete? It's a bold idea, but looking at the history of the U.S. and the U.K., it might just be the only idea that works.
It is certainly a conversation worth having.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.
A pleasure as always.
We'll catch you on the next one.